Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. Leah Shade, and I teach preaching and worship at Lexington Theological Seminary in Kentucky. This video is for the member of the sermon feedback group who will serve as the facilitator. You will have an important role to play in this session. So I want to share with you some guidelines and tips for how to effectively moderate the conversation. First, I want to clarify that you are not expected to be an expert in preaching or the Bible or theology. Your preacher invited you to take on this role because they trust you and they believe you have the potential to be an effective facilitator. The main reason we need a facilitator for the sermon feedback group is to allow the preacher to be fully engaged in the feedback from the group without having the burden of running the session. The facilitator's job will be to do the following. You'll convene the group once everyone has arrived. You'll offer an opening prayer. You'll encourage people to keep their initial comments brief so that there is time for everyone to share their thoughts. You'll be moving the discussion through the different stages. You'll also moderate the discussion at every stage along the way, and you'll close the session with prayer. The sermon feedback sessions should take approximately 60 minutes. And it would be great if you or someone in the group could provide some drinks and snacks for everyone in order to feed their bodies and brains while discussing preaching and sermons. So what are your responsibilities as the facilitator for the sermon feedback group? One is to encourage an exchange of views, both among the sermon feedback group participants and between the group and the preacher. You'll want to manage the room well, and I'm going to give you some pointers for that in a couple of slides. You want to model good sermon feedback skills yourself in a friendly, relaxed manner. You want to keep the conversation respectful and on task, not just going off on bunny trails or down rabbit holes. And you'll want to stay neutral. Now, to be clear, staying neutral does not mean that you can't express your own thoughts about the sermon. But your primary role is to play the host to this exchange of ideas. This means that when it comes time for the group to share their feedback, you should always invite the other participants to speak first, and you should go last in the rounds of giving feedback. Now, of course, you can ask clarifying questions if necessary, and if you see an opportunity to ask a thoughtful or probing question to get to a deeper level in the discussion, you can certainly do so. Encouraging reflection on the part of both the feedback givers and the preachers is a good goal to have. As you learned in the video how to give effective sermon feedback, you and the others in the group will use these sermon talkback questions. So it would be good for you to fill out your own responses to those questions when listening to the sermon so that you can contribute to the feedback as well. Now let's go through the sequence of events for a sermon feedback session and what your role will be as a facilitator. As I explained in the previous video, you'll want to gather in a circle or around the table so that it feels like a discussion and not an interview. You, as the facilitator of the group, will call everyone to gather around and you will begin with prayer. Then you're going to invite the preacher to say what kind of feedback they're looking for in regards to the sermon. Whatever that is, you want to keep it in mind so that this aspect of the sermon is addressed sometime during the session. Then you'll ask each person to share one thing they really appreciated about the sermon or what resonated for them. As a reminder, always start with positive feedback, and each person should just share one thing so that others have a chance to contribute. As you're facilitating the session, you have some choices for how you can respond after each person shares. You can simply move on to the next speaker or ask the group for additional comments, but you want to avoid asking questions like, who agrees with John or Susan? Because this session is not about seeking consensus about the sermon, and you don't want to ask whether others agree with the opinion or feedback being offered. Rather, it's about allowing each person to share how they received the sermon. So another choice is to paraphrase what a person has said in order to clarify the point. Or you can ask a probing or follow-up question to get clarification or to go deeper. This is especially helpful if a person makes either a overgeneralized or a superficial point. This is also where you can remind them about the feedback technique called situation behavior impact, which you learned about in the previous video. After each person has had a chance to share their thoughts, you can invite the preacher to respond to what has been said, or you can wait till everybody has shared and then have the preacher give their response. Either way, whether the preacher responds after each person or at the end of that segment is fine. After you finish the segment on appreciation and words of encouragement and what resonated about the sermon, you're going to move into a period of constructive critique. And you're going to remind the group of these general questions. Were there things about the sermon that were either unclear or confusing or inconsistent? Were there growing edges that you think the preacher could work on? Is there something that they think could have been improved? Again, remind the participants to share just one thing so that everyone has a chance to contribute. In this stage of constructive critique, you'll want to have handy the PDF from the readings that lists the 10 mistakes to avoid when giving feedback. I want to focus on just a few of those and how to counter or pivot from them if you hear people making these mistakes in their feedback. So if you hear feedback that judges the preacher rather than the content of the sermon, you can suggest reframing the comments so that it's about the sermon itself, not the preacher as a person. If the feedback is too vague, remind people to use the situation behavior impact technique. You can also ask, could you tell us more about why you think this way about the sermon? If a person gives feedback that speaks for others, like, well, my husband thought that your sermon was, and however they describe it, you want to invite them to say what feedback they would like to share on their own behalf. If the feedback is exaggerated with generalities, like, you always do this, or you never say this, you'll want to redirect them with the situation behavior impact technique. If the feedback psychoanalyzes the motives behind the behavior, what went into the sermon, like if somebody says, I think maybe you wanted to say that in the sermon because of your health issues, that would be inappropriate. So you want to remind the person to focus on how the sermon affected them. What do you do if a person's feedback goes on too long? Well, if that happens, it is okay to diplomatically interrupt. A good way to do this is simply to say the person's name and then pivot to another person in the group. For example, if someone is sort of going on and on, I might gently interrupt and say, Bill, I just want to interrupt for a minute. I think you're making a really interesting point, and I wonder if Kate would like to build on that. Now, if you have a person who seems to be quieter than the rest, it's okay to invite them to share. For example, you might say, Denise, I see your wheels turning. Would you like to jump in here with your thoughts? They may or may not respond, but at least you've opened the door for them. Again, once everyone has had a chance to share one piece of constructive feedback, you can ask the preacher to respond, or the preacher can respond along the way if needed. This first part of the sermon feedback session with the initial comments and the feedback should take about 45 minutes. And then you'll spend the last 15 minutes with any other questions or issues that hadn't yet come up. So here you'll want to come back to make sure that the aspect of the sermon that the preacher wanted feedback on is addressed. As you're moving through these stages of the sermon feedback group, I want to share with you 2 more tips that might be helpful to you. So these are some more techniques that you'll find useful. One is validating the positive intent of a comment. This is where you identify the underlying core value of what somebody says. For example, if somebody says, I really like the way the preacher described being by still waters in the sermon about the 23rd Psalm, you can say, it sounds like vivid imagery was meaningful for you. Thank you for sharing that. Now, this can also be useful when there is negative feedback that comes across a bit too harsh and doesn't land well. For example, if someone says, there was just too much going on in the sermon and I couldn't keep track of everything, you can respond, it sounded like you felt a bit overwhelmed by that aspect of the sermon. What do you think could have helped to simplify it? Another technique that is useful is to acknowledge the feelings and emotions. Sermons often touch our hearts and elicit strong emotions. So if someone expresses this in a comment, it's always good to follow up with an affirmation of that feeling. For example, if someone says that a particular point in the sermon made them uncomfortable or even angry, you can respond, I really appreciate your willingness to be open about how that part of the sermon affected you. Can you say more about that? Conversely, if a positive emotion is expressed, you might say, it sounds like the preacher really hit the mark for you in terms of feeling joy or inspired or gratitude. Do you want to say more about that? While it is unlikely that the conversation will get heated during the sermon feedback session, there is that possibility. As I said before, emotions can run high and disagreements can happen when it comes to the content of a sermon. So here are ideas for what to say if the conversation gets too heated. First of all, just say, let's pause for a moment. I'm noticing that emotions are getting heated at this point. And I just want to do a feeling check-in to see how folks are doing right now emotionally. So if each of you could share one word about how you're feeling in the process right now, I think that might be helpful. After each person has shared, you would say, thank you for sharing this. Having strong emotions about a sermon is actually normal and to be expected. Many of us are very passionate about this. There's something important at stake for us in this. I do want to remind everyone about avoiding those 10 mistakes in giving feedback and make sure we're coming back to situation, behavior, impact in our comments. And then at the end, offer a brief prayer. For example, Holy Spirit, you are truly in this place. We offer our feelings into your care so that we might continue with this dialogue, guided by your wisdom for your purposes. Amen. And then you can continue with the session. So you want to keep in mind that the purpose of the sermon feedback group is not necessarily to solve a problem or resolve an issue. Rather, it is to explore and reflect on the content and delivery of the sermon together with the preacher so that everyone can learn and grow. Finally, you will end the session with prayer and the time will be complete. I recommend that you, as the facilitator, stay until the other participants have left in order to debrief with the preacher about how the session went. And here are some questions that you both can discuss together. What made the session meaningful or helpful? Were there things that were unhelpful or frustrating? How did you see the relationship growing or developing among the group and between the group and the preacher? In what ways did you see people's faith deepen through the session? I hope this video has been helpful as you're planning your first sermon feedback session. I want to encourage you to see this group as an opportunity to deepen your relationship with God and with God's people, as well as help your preacher to improve their sermons with this congregation. Again, thank you for agreeing to serve as a sermon feedback facilitator, and may God bless your discussions.